and I'm back because what once was will be again. I got my thinking cap on so we can use some history, mythology, and astrology to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And this time we're going to talk about the overall concept of a song of ice and fire. That this is in fact about an ongoing war between the lands of always winter and the lands of always summer. And most people are looking at all the prophecies and looking at who's who and who's born, and that Jon Snow is obviously from the north and he's ice, and Dany's got dragons, so she's fire. So here's the constant in the Song of Ice and Fire. But really, the story, which forms the background, the War of the Roses, that ended with the marriage of the two warring houses, we comprehend that it has to be Jon and Daenerys because it's ice and fire. But are Jon and Daenerys at war yet? They're not actually the ones at war. There's been an ongoing war in the background of this story for thousands and thousands of years. And we've been helpfully told a little bit about this story. So while we're all focusing on who is Jon Snow's parents, Rhaegar and Lyanna, as if that's the constant, that is not the constant in this story from which to develop any ideas. The constant is a song of ice and fire. And what was the war? When did it begin? Who was it between? And how did it end those many years ago? And it wasn't because some dude wielded a sword. It was because that war came to a close through a compact that was sealed with a marriage. Because what was will be again, and that's what's going to happen, is there's going to be a compact that ends the war for a brief period of time anyways, to seal this pact, and that's Jon Snow and Daenerys. And we'll get to their parentage, but first, before we do anything else, we actually have to understand what the background story is. And we've noticed it, but then we kind of cast it aside as one of those, well, that was that thing that happened before. It's the thing that's still happening. So we get the story of many, many years ago, thousands and thousands of years ago, the children of the forest lived in Westeros and held all the lands as their own. And essentially, you get the idea that it was the land of always spring. There was no winter. There was no summer. It was very much like the Garden of Eden. It was always spring. Things were always blooming. There were always fruit upon the trees, etc., etc. And as Leaf once explained, at one time, they had extremely long lives, the children of the forest, but they had very few children. And this was the balance of nature, so that they did not become overcrowded and overuse the resources. So this is a balance. They don't have very many children, but they get long lives instead. Then come along the first men. We get the idea that the first men were relatively primitive, though they had some tools, and that they began to cut down woods and things of that nature, and it caused a war between themselves and the children of the forest. And this war went on for several thousand years. And then some sort of compact was supposedly signed on the isle called God's Eye, in which they agreed on who would live where and who would use what resources. Obviously, as someone pointed out, that you don't come to the table to negotiate a compact unless somebody felt that they were winning and somebody else felt that they were losing, but that both sides felt that they would continue to lose in this struggle. And you get that it's an allegory for man's war with nature, essentially. And he probably never saw it as a war. He saw it as his survival. And we can see that through prehistoric times to modern times. And we get that part of the compact was that the first men would agree to worship the trees, leave their trees alone, and follows the children of the forest similar religions and ideas and ways of living. And so you get that as an allegory that man as caveman was essentially at war constantly with nature, and he eventually developed tools in which he was starting to sort of control nature and or impact nature. But then as time rolled on, he became somewhat tribal, and his use of nature was not necessarily destructive, that he believed in this idea of, that he was one with nature, and what he took, he put back, or only take so much because he needed nature to live. But we know that as man advanced and he developed better tools and better understanding, and this idea that and longer survival, basically, and more children, that he began to build again some more, and therefore he began to take more resources. And this is pretty much the allegory for man throughout history. And then we get this story that we saw in Bran's flashback, and then he was talking to Leaf about it, that what the children did was they essentially created winter. So before that, winter apparently did not exist, or if it did not exist in the manner in which we experience winter as a cycling season now. And how they created this was they stuck this man and tied him to a tree. He didn't look particularly voluntary, but he might have been. And then they stuck a piece of dragon glass through his heart. Now, one of the things that I think people tend to focus on is, well, oh, look, dragon glass. Well, it can kill the walkers and it can kill the others. And we get the idea from Benjen Stark that they stopped the other's magic by sticking some dragon glass in him. And we see this story of how the others were created in the first place because they put dragon glass in them. So if dragon glass can kill the others and stop their magic in Benjen Stark, how then did it create the magic in them when it was stuck in his heart? And I think the part that most people have missed was what he was tied to. What tree was he tied to? He was tied to the tree, the All tree, where everybody goes into the All. And there's that one big main tree where the Blood Raven was in it and that Bran was attaching himself to. That's the main tree. So what they did is they tied him to that tree, and when they stuck the dragon glass into him, they probably stuck it into the tree as well, threw him into the tree. Because really what the dragon glass is just a conduit. It's just the conduit. It is not the thing that changes people. Why does it change the others? Or why does it destroy the others? Because when you stick it into them, without it being attached to something else, it is like a funnel. So not only could it funnel something in, it funnels stuff out. That's what dragon glass is. This is what happened to Benjen Stark. So the Children of the Forest created a nuclear option by creating a being that could create winter wherever they went. They weren't just part of the winter. They were the winter gods. They were the gods of winter. Okay? And conversely, there has been consistently the gods of summer, or the beings of summer. So at the end, as Leaf explained, eventually the children just sort of disappeared. And the war was no longer between them, because we get the idea that at some point it became a war between the winter and the first men, who came down out of the north, and the winter spread almost all over Westeros and killed thousands, possibly millions. And it was a long night, and it was so cold, as Nan said, that people, Nan the old nurse, people froze in their beds, kings as well as shepherds in their huts. So at the end of the day, the war between the children of the forest and those of the first men became a non-entity. It was no longer the war. The war began between the others in the north in the winter and those who were in the south, or the lands of the summer. And then a hero came forth bearing a light sword that drove the others back. So we get that there's potential this person developed a tool and or had some tools, multiple tools, because I'm going to say that was helping to drive back the others and actually defeat them. But it probably wasn't like they were going to win, period. Because how do you win against a force that can raise the dead against you no matter what? So this war went on for a really long time, and man, as they say, was almost wiped off the face of the earth. So even though this hero had a tool and he was able to drive the others back, it wasn't as if he had a final victory, or that he would have a final victory, that if he continued to press this fight against the others, that his losses would be so much that he couldn't win in the long run. His forces would be destroyed. Man would be destroyed. So even though he's in a winning position at that point, he still is in a weakened position. So what do? Well, you would make a compact with the other side about what was going to be the agreement, who was going to live where, and where the dividing line was, the wall, and who was going to have domain over those areas, and what was the rules of the game, and finally, how do you seal this compact? Well, there's a story that involves the Starks possibly having been married into the others, or having other blood, because they're really from the north. So it seems like the compact would be sealed by a marriage, which is what we see that's likely to be happening with Jon Snow and Daenerys. So keep that in mind. So the overall war that was and still is and is about to happen again is the war between ice and fire, or the lands of always winter and the lands of always summer. And when that war begins, it can be the destruction of man, or you make another compact. You seal an agreement with the same process. So now you have to look at who is of the winter, who's ice, and who's fire. And once you understand that, that is when you will understand who the probable parents are of each of the people. And we're going to talk about next the lands of winter and the inhabitants and the stories that we know about them. And then we'll talk about where the lands of always summer are. Thank you very much. Talk to you later.